Cambodia. The US is putting even more pressure on Cambodia. Cambodia is a Southeast Asian country. It's got between 16 to 17 million people, so it's not really the largest country in the region. It's also not really the most prosperous country in the region. It had suffered tremendously, just like Laos to the north of it and Vietnam to the east of it. It suffered tremendously during the US war with Vietnam, which also included military campaigns and proxy wars in the surrounding region. What is the US doing now? US, here, let's take a look at this. US orders arms embargo on Cambodia, cites Chinese influence. So this is right after the US-led democracy summit talking about freedom, human rights. Everyone should have the right to choose their destiny, right? This is what we always hear from the West, and yet here's the West and the US in particular telling Cambodia that they're not allowed to pick their own friends. They're not allowed to decide how they form relationships with other countries. And if they try to do things in a way that does not suit US interests, they will be punished for it. That is really what this article says. So let's take a look here. This is from CNBC. This follows sanctions that were already put on several senior Cambodian leaders. And it says the added restrictions on defense-related goods and services issued by the state and commerce departments are due to be published and take effect Thursday. So this was early this month, December 2021. A notice in the Federal Register said developments in Cambodia were contrary to U.S. national security and foreign policy interests. And what are they talking about? They're talking about the U.S. and its desperate desire to reassert primacy over the entirety of Asia, a region of the planet the U.S. is not even located in. It's located in North America, for people that don't know. And so its inability to reassert itself over Asia, anyone who is involved in impeding that is considered a national security risk, which is kind of contradictory toward what you would intuitively think national security entailed, some kind of actual threat to the United States itself. No, when the US talks about national security interests or foreign policy interests, they're talking about the preservation, or in some cases, the expansion of its modern day empire. They also talk about all of these other countries that it's imposing these sort of measures and controls on right here. Myanmar, China, Russia, and Venezuela. And if you follow the news, you'll notice that the US is putting sanctions on everyone, embargoes on everyone, trying to seize everyone's ships, bullying absolutely everyone. And it's not just countries like Myanmar, China, Russia, and Venezuela. You could probably add Iran and Cuba to the list. It's also countries in Europe. I don't know if people remember, but Germany was building this Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Russia, and the US threatened to put sanctions on them. As a matter of fact, they did put sanctions on some German companies, and they forced the German government to take all of these measures to try to sidestep and circumvent them. So even America's own supposed allies get this treatment if they impede America's unilateral global ambitions, which, when you really think about it, it's the US imposing itself on other countries and on other regions and telling countries, you're not going to do this because it impedes what we want to do to this region that your country is located in. This isn't the first time the US has had some kind of issue with Cambodia. As a matter of fact, if you read through this article, you're going to see for quite a while the US have been trying to assert control over Cambodia, influence and control, and incrementally over the years it has kind of receded. They also talk about this port, Cambodia's Riam naval base, and how they might host the Chinese Navy there. And the irony here is the US is upset about this because they're claiming this is China expanding its military presence where? In Asia, where China is located, thousands upon thousands of miles away from US shores. And they're talking about this port in Cambodia that the Chinese might be invited to. a port where the US was trying to get itself invited to. So it's one of those cases where do as I say, not as I do. It's okay for the US to have its military spread all over the planet, and in some cases illegally occupying a country against the will of the people living there. I want to point something else out here. This follows the US's, for many years, their attempt to install a client regime into power in Cambodia. The current prime minister of Cambodia is Hun Sen. Hun Sen has been in power since the mid-1980s, so he's been in power for a really long time. And the US doesn't like strongmen being in power in any particular country, because if they are particularly strong, if their position is secure politically, then it's much harder to coerce them. And so what they had been doing for many, many years is cultivating this guy, Kem Sokha. And he is one of the senior leaders of the Cambodian National Rescue Party. And what's interesting about Kem Sokha is that he, at one point, admitted that the US was aiding him in overthrowing the Cambodian government and installing him and his political party into power. That's what this article right here is all about, the Phnom Penh Post. Sokha video producer closes Phnom Penh office in fear. So this is what he was actually on video caught saying. They said, if we want to change the leadership, we cannot fight the top. Before changing the top level, we need to uproot the lower one. We need to change the lower level first. It is a political strategy in a democratic country, which, you know, who knows what he's talking about? He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's just repeating what his American handlers tell him. So it's like a filtered and garbled version of what the US was telling him. And the US that has assisted me, they asked me to take the model from Yugoslavia, Serbia, where they can change the dictator, Slobodan Milosevic. And he's referring to the former Serbian and Yugoslavian leader who resigned amid popular protests following disputed elections and died while on trial for war crimes. Of course, we know it wasn't a popular uprising. It was funded by the US government. And we know that because the New York Times told us, you know, the question, who really brought down Milosevic? The New York Times tells us American assistance to Oktar and the 18 parties that ultimately ousted Milosevic is still a highly sensitive subject, but Paul McCarthy, an official with the Washington-based National Endowment for Democracy, is ready to divulge some details. From August 1999, the dollar started to flow to Oktar pretty significantly. Of the almost $3 million spent by his group in Serbia, they're talking about the National Endowment for Democracy, Oktar was certainly the largest recipient. The money went into Oktar's accounts outside Serbia. At the time, McCarthy held a series of meetings with the movement's leadership. We had a lot of financial help from Western non-governmental organizations and also some Western governmental organizations. And you got to be real careful with that, because a lot of people will try to claim that the National Endowment for Democracy is some sort of independent organization. It is not. It was created by the US government. It is funded annually by the US government, and it is overseen by the US Congress and the US State Department. So it is not independent in any shape, form, or way. So when they talk about the Yugoslavia model, or they're referring to Serbia, they're talking about the US government building up and sponsoring an opposition to overthrow the government and then be installed into power. And of course, being in debt to Washington and serving Washington's interests, not the interests of the people actually living in the country whose government just got overthrown. Let's get back to this Kem Sokha video. So they're saying, you know, Milosevic had a huge number of tanks, but they changed things by using this strategy, and they take this experience for me to implement in Cambodia, but no one knew about this. They're experts, professors at universities in Washington, D.C., Montreal, Canada, hired by the Americans in order to advise me on strategy to change the dictator leader in Cambodia. So this is what the U.S. was doing in Cambodia. They were directly meddling in Cambodia's internal political affairs, interfering in their elections, building up a political opposition movement in the country beholden to the United States. It is a blatant violation of the UN Charter regarding non-interference and political independence. And this is what Cambodia has been reacting to, uprooting this network. And when they do this, of course, what does the US do in response? They accuse Cambodia of human rights abuses. And then once they start accusing Cambodia of human rights abuses, this is where they're able to level sanctions against Cambodia's leadership and now enact arms embargoes. So despite all of this pressure, the constant meddling the United States is doing inside of Cambodia, the sanctions, and now embargoes the US is placing on Cambodia, Cambodia is steadfast in building closer relations with China and also the rest of ASEAN. Now that's interesting because check this out. This is Cambodia's exports by partner in 2019. And as you can see, the United States is their largest export market. And then if you look at Europe and North America combined, it's greater than its exports to the rest of Asia. Now, imports is a totally different story. This is what kind of makes Cambodia a little bit unique. Most countries in Southeast Asia, their largest trade partner for exports and imports is China. So Cambodia is kind of an outliner here. But despite this, despite its dependency on the West for its exports, it's still choosing to go with China. It's a no-brainer. Every country in the region, many countries around the world are waking up to the fact that even if the price to pay is extremely heavy now for working with China, in the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be worth it. Subordinating yourself to the West, which is in terminal decline, and the West, which even when you subordinate yourself to them, will still abuse you, exploit you, and leave you in ruins. It's a no-brainer why Cambodia is doing this, despite all the pressure the U.S. is putting on them. Now, you've got Cambodia. The U.S. is leaning heavy on Thailand. The U.S. is trying to completely destroy Myanmar. There has been pressure and protests in Malaysia, although I haven't really seen them gain any traction recently. The U.S. is hard at work across the entire region. This idea of the Milk Tea Alliance and all of these U.S.-sponsored protests ruining the entire region in a coordinated fashion like the U.S. did in the Arab Spring from 2011 onward. This is very much ongoing. The region needs to unite. They need to look into national security laws to uproot all of this foreign interference. Now, Cambodia has done a really good job at uprooting the US-backed opposition and all of the organizations sponsored by the US government supporting them. The rest of the region needs to do this, and they need to work together doing this. And as a matter of fact, they're trying to do it quietly and carefully so they don't provoke. This is what's going on in Cambodia right now. I'm going to keep an eye on it, as always. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share it. Think about subscribing. It's free to do, and it helps the channel grow. I have a website, newatlas.report. You can find and follow all of my work there. There are no ads. There is no paywall. There never will be. So please bookmark it and share it with others. If I ever get deleted off of YouTube, I am still going to be able to embed videos on that website from other video sharing platforms. So please get in the habit of checking there for my videos. I am back on Twitter for the time being at Brian_Berletic, and I'm also on Weibo. You can see the ID there at the bottom of the screen, but the link to it, which will be a lot easier to just click on, that'll be in the video description below. Also in the video description below are all of the articles that I just talked about in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. To everyone who has been, whether it's through Patreon month to month, or through one-time donations, or even if you're just helping share my work, that is really helpful. I could not do this work without that help, so thank you very much. And as always, thank you for watching.